Welcome to People, Places, Planet Pod, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to ensure a healthy environment, prosperous economies, and vibrant communities founded on the rule of law.
Welcome to this week's episode of the People, Places, Planet podcast. I am your host, Georgia Ray. Today, I will be speaking with Aisha Ramush, a visiting attorney and doctoral researcher here at ELI, in what I hope will be the first episode in a series featuring ELI's visiting attorneys and scholars. For those that do not know, ELI's Visiting Attorney and Scholar program provides critical work and knowledge to the organization. ELI hosts environmental lawyers, practitioners, and scholars working on policy research projects aimed at American environmental policy and at environmental policy on the international level and national level in other countries. These residencies help to strengthen institutional bonds and stimulate intellectual activity across disciplines and borders. Aisha herself has come to ELI as part of a Fulbright grant awarded to her for a project entitled The U.S. Influence on French Environmental Policy, a Transatlantic Emergence of an Environmental Presidency in 1970. A French national, her work considers the shared core institution of the presidency in the United States and France and the influence said office has on environmental protection. She is currently a PhD candidate at University Paris-Saclay with a dissertation focus on the French presidency and environmental protection. Previously, she received a bachelor's degree of law from the University Paris-Saclay and a master's degree from the same institution. Her master's thesis considered the origins of political ecology and the notion of nature in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's State of Nature. Today, I will ask Aisha questions about her work and her experiences with ELI. Aisha, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Georgia, for this invitation and initiative.
I want to start with the concept of a visiting attorney here at ELI. For our listeners, how connected are you to the overall organization, and what does a day in the life look like?
Well, I connected with ELI members a couple of months ago now. Actually, it was in January 2022, almost a year now, while preparing my application for the Fulbright program scholarship. And I am hosted here at ELI as a visiting attorney. So basically, I conduct my research very independently, but I got to know and to meet various ELI fellows with whom I have regular meetings, check-ins on ELI projects, and some of them are really good resources for me. I think ELI is a really great framework. I can see how a nonprofit concretely work. And I use their educational tools and interact with various actors. They interact with various actors, either governmental, non-governmental. So it's very teaching for me to be hosted at ELI.
Now, to get into the reason you're here in the United States, your research, you mentioned you are funded on the Fulbright in the United States, and you're focusing on the 1970s in both France and the United States. Something that happened in the 1970s in both countries was that France's Ministry of the Environment was created and the EPA was established here in the United States. Was that pure serendipity? Was there a cultural, historical moment that contributed to that almost concurrent establishment? I'd love to hear, what you found in your research, because even just knowing that those two things happened around the same time was news to me when I read a little bit about what you've been doing.
Interesting. So it's good to see that you learned something with this research. Actually, the question. This is actually the starting question of the research. These two phenomena happened in these two different countries at the same time. And I think there's a little bit of serendipity. It is also a cultural and a historical moment, a shared cultural and historical moments. These two elements can be a justification of this same phenomenon. So the 1970s, more generally, is a fascinating area in the history of environmentalism, both in France and in the US. US and France had shared this same momentum, I would say, in the history of environmentalism. In 1970, Georges Pompidou, which was the president of France at the time, visited the United States from February 28th to March 2. Yeah. He made this very famous address, famous at least in France, in Chicago, in which he refers directly for the first time to the necessity of reducing pollution and reducing human harm to the environment, to natural resources. And he literally said, we must have a moral of the environment. So the vocabulary is a bit outdated, but it reflects a fledgling environmental concern and awareness from political leaders and from the French president, which is actually very new. So it is this discourse, this address is a milestone in the history of environmentalism in France. It is often quoted. And at the same time, almost at the same time, in January 1970, Nixon also declared that he became convinced that the 70s absolutely must be the years when America pays its debt to the past by reclaiming the purity of its air, its water, and the living environment. In his State of Union address on January 22, 1970, he also stressed on the fact that restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. Less than a year later, after this visit of Georges Pompidou in the United States, the Ministry of the Environment has been created, a real Ministry of the Environment, because in 1969 in France, the Ministry of the Agriculture has been organized in order to include a little bureau direction, actually. So a little team specialized on the protection of nature and environment. So in 1971, a completely independent institution has been created and specialized in environmental issues. So I think what happened in the 70s is basically that it was a moment of general consensus. So it was a scientific consensus. It was also a general awareness that was led by the development of the green political thought. I refer here to the major work of Rachel Carson that basically spread almost revolution, and her work in 62, the Silent Spring, reached France, obviously. In France, we have also famous scientists who published major work. I'm referring here to Jean Dorst, Before Nature Dies. His work was published in French in 65, if I remember well, and it has been translated in English in the 70s. So it was a very dynamic area for environmentalism and for environmental activism this time, switching from the era of conservation to more far-reaching political to enhance environment protection. So it was an activism from both civil society and governmental and institutional actors.
That's really interesting that you kind of have those parallel schools of thought in both countries at the same time. And this is me going a little bit off script, but I'm interested to know that speech that is so famous happened in Chicago. Do you know why it took place there? Was there any reason for the Chicago location? Any importance?
I think it was a coincidence because it was organized by the Alliance Française, and it was organized by the Council of Foreign Policies of Chicago. It was a coincidence. It was not the place where it occurred was not. I don't think there is a link between the topic of the environment and the city, but I might be wrong. I never thought about this before.
Well, I'm sorry to put you on the spot then.
No, it's okay.
There have been other parallels in France and the United States environmental regulatory journeys. Can you talk a little bit about those?
So I would say that there was like a shared agenda in both countries during the 60s and during the 70s in terms of development of environmental policies. I can't enumerate all of them, but definitely we have in the 60s in the United States the Wilderness Act of 64. In France, we had a major act regarding water protection. Same year, 64, we have this first law regarding atmospheric pollutions in 61 in France. And we have the Clean Air Act in 63. In France, of course, we have this, I mentioned it earlier, during the 70s, the creation of this direction, which is like a small team within the Ministry of Agriculture dedicated to the nature environment protection. This was created in 69, beginning of 70. And at the same time, in the United States, we have the NEPA adopted somewhere between 69 and 70. The Council of Environmental Quality has been created same time too, same year, 69, 70. Environmental Protection, EPA, has been created in 70. So, and I can continue, the list goes on, it's long, and we have the Endangered Species Act in 73, the Clean Air Water Act in 72, and we have more or less the same legislation has been also implemented in France. But here, I think the list is a bit longer on the behalf of the United States. They were way more proactive than France at this period, I would say.
Gotcha. And thematically, are there a lot of similarities, or is it more just environmental regulations in general are happening at the same time? Or is it things like, when speaking about endangered species, both countries are enacting legislation on that at the same time?
Well, I think it's generally there was like the same movement that has been started at the time. So it doesn't the teams and do not match all the time and systematically, but in some major topics they match, such as air, water. In France, we have this major law in 76, which recognized the general interest in protecting the environment. So basically, it made an environment being a national priority. So this is also interesting. So it's not a perfect comparative chart between the two countries, but we can definitely see that in both countries, the same concern was present, and we can read it in the various legislation that had been implemented at this time.
I know your research wasn't only concerned with identifying these parallels, but also asking the question of why they exist. So you're not done yet, but to this point, what have you found?
Yeah, this is a very fascinating question, because I think it flirts with the limit of regular legal research, because the more I investigate those topics, and the more I believe that the most common point of the emergence of the environmental, what we call, some scholar call the environmental presidency, is actually the role played by the advisors, the bureaucracy, while creating new administrations of the environment in both countries, in both France and United States. So, when we read a lot of works, we stress a lot on the presidential initiatives, but it's not the logical, and the movement is not actually a top-bottom movement, but rather a bottom-on-top movement. What I mean by that is implementing administrations specialized in environmental policies means that you have to be aware of all the details and all the subtleties of the administration and how it can actually work effectively to enhance environmental protection to enhance a public policy, a new public policy. And I think the one that are more qualified to do that, the one that are more qualified to advise President Pompidou and Richard Nixon are actually the ones who actually already worked in administration: scientists, bureaucrats, statesmen, advisors, political advisors. So this is what's interesting, because I think in both countries, and while reading and while furthering this research, I'm just noticing the fact that it's bureaucracy that actually leads to institutionalize and improve environmental public policies while implementing new administrations. It has been done in the United States thanks to Ash Council with this Ash memo that advised for the creation of the NOAA and the EPA, for example. So what I appreciate about this research is that I'm exploring this limit of a classical comparison between French and US environmental law, because I have also to take into account the fact that the emergence of the presidential awareness to environmental policies is also determined by political factors, administrative factors, and also human factors. But what's interesting also is when I read sometimes in some documents in archives in France that the first protagonist of the creation of the Ministry of Environment said that the idea is literally imported from the US. I'm referring here to some testimonies, especially the one of Serge Antoine, a statesman who basically was one of the first bureaucrats who helped to think, draft, and work in the first Ministry of Environment before Robert Poujade, the first Minister of the Environment, being appointed. So it's also interesting to be more focused about the human factors, the one that actually advised presidents, the ones that helped to draft the first structures of the administrative of these environmental administrations.
Yeah, you just got into it a little bit, this focus on the executive branch in your research. But how has the Office of the President influenced environmental policy in the two different countries differently, similarly? What is the role there and what have you found?
So what is interesting, for example, in the US is Richard Nixon advisors were extremely important in this whole process of creating a new administration and a whole new administration specialized in environmental policies. I'm referring to, I'm not sure about all the pronunciations, but Ruckelshaus, who was appointed as the first administration of the EPA, Russell Train, who was one of the first, chairman of the Council of Environmental Quality, and then second administrator of the EPA. The role of John Ehrlichman, the White House counsel and assistant to the president for domestic affairs, is extremely important in the emergence of environmental policies and environmental administration. It's not about Nixon initiative. A lot of articles I read are more focused about the fact that Richard Nixon was a convinced environmentalist. No, it's not this. It's a little bit more complex than that. And same thing in France. Georges Pompidou was not an environmentalist convinced person. He basically and genuinely created an administration specialized in environmental policy because there's also a political opportunity while doing so. So I think this is one of the main common point in the two countries is there was an opportunity, a political opportunity, and it has been seized, and it has been seized, and it was regarding environmental policy. I think it could have been another policy.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say it's not so much about individuals having this environmentalism in their ideas, but just a political moment that primed the executive branch.
The importance of the administrative change has to be well understood here, because it's thanks to the administrative changes, thanks to the reorganization plan of 1970, that actually those administrations were able to be created. I'm referring to the NOAA and the EPA here. It was a political opportunity that has been seized.
And I want to ask a little bit of a lighter question as well on these similarities and differences between the US and France. You know, part of your program, you're on a Fulbright here, so you are living in the United States, but obviously you spent most of your life in France. How has your experience been in real life? What are you surprised about coming to the US, you know, and what do you like about living here?
Okay, let's talk about my Washingtonian experience then. I think I really enjoyed the amazing people that I got to meet here. I think that Washington, D.C. is a unique city in the United States, almost a bubble. I have an endless list of trivial things that surprised me while arriving here. This is my first time in the U.S., actually, so a lot of things surprises me, very trivial things. But I would say that what surprises me the most, scared me a little bit too, is how far my ecological and environmentalist ideals were, and how my expectations for a more environmental and more ecological future were high. And while seeing energy consumption here, we're seeing the lack of public transportation. So I'm not going to be very critical, but I think a lot of people know that the US lifestyle is not very environmental friendly, to be very politically correct here.
No, I'm glad you say that, because it's true. And if that's something you're noticing, you know, as somebody coming to this country, then that's a great point to make.
Yeah. See, I think this was definitely cultural shock from me as a European seeing this. So, but I love Washington D.C. I think it's a great city, and also I love the people that I got to meet in Eli, and professors and students at GW, George Washington University, where I also attend some classes as a visiting student researcher scholar there. And I think I have a great experience here in Washington, D.C., being in these two institutions. Yeah.
Well, that's, I think, a good transition, you know, speaking about your classes at GW and the work you're doing at ELI, kind of moving back towards, you've long been interested in these cross-cultural legal questions related to environmental protection. In addition to your most recent focus comparing the US and France, you also spent some time in Morocco. What can you tell us about the Moroccan environmental protection and how it compares to the French and even American system?
Yeah, this is a great question. My experience of Moroccan environmental law goes back to 2018 while being an intern in a law firm there. And one of the law firm associates made me discover the legal framework of wetlands in Morocco and public lands in general. She was, I think, personally involved in an association of residents near one of the last wetlands of this urbanized metropole of Casablanca. And it was a pure coincidence. And while doing some research on this, like on the side of what I was doing for the law firm, I just discovered the similarities between French and Moroccan public property law and public land law. And this makes sense. I mean, both countries share the common history, the reminiscences of French law during colonization is still visible. A lot of regulatory aspects are absolutely specific to Moroccan ancient and current constitutional history and regime. I'm referring here to many royal decrees that still rule and enforce environmental law there. So there are also some legal categories that are similar in both countries, but so if a comparison can be made, it can only be made with the French legal system, obviously. Probably that can also be found between US and Morocco, but I doubt so. These are two countries of two different legal cultures and traditions, and I did not study this in depth, but I doubt there is any comparison that can be made between both countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. You obviously have two very different histories underlying the legal mechanisms in America and Morocco. Well, I'm on to my final question here today, and I hope this will become a regular question for the visiting scholars and attorneys that I interview on this podcast. But how has ELI as an organization and the Visiting Scholars/Attorneys program more specifically supported you in your work?
ELI supported me well, inviting me. And while preparing this application for the Fulbright program, that enabled me to come to say special thank to Jared Page. It has been incredibly helpful during the long process of this application. And even here, while being here in the United States, he's been super helpful all the time, always available to answer my questions and my concerns about environmental law in general. And ELI is a great place. I mean, it's the heart of Washington, D.C. It's a great actor and institution that actually collaborates and sponsors a lot of events with GW. So these institutions work in common on various events, and being here and there definitely made this experience in Washington, D.C. It's a great place to work.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. And I know we at ELI have appreciated you being here the past couple months and are excited to hear more about what you have found in your research as you wrap up your time here in the U.S. So thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I really loved hearing more about what you've been doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Georgia, for having me and for this invitation.
Of course.
Thank you for tuning in to People, Places, Planet Pod, brought to you by the Environmental Law Institute. We would like to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and ideas to podcast@eli.org. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, attending one of our events, reading our publications, or becoming a member, please visit our website at www.eli.org.